All right. Well, if you remember back, been about a year and a half, we did the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and now we're going to begin a couple month study on the last 14 chapters of Genesis. Mainly, I was going to call this Joseph, but we could more say Joseph and his brothers because it's about all of them, but mainly him, of course. It's one of my favorite stories of the Bible, Joseph. When you look at people with there's a lot of flawed people in the Bible in the Old Testament. Joseph is one of the few that has virtually nothing. The only possible one we'll talk about today, and we'll begin today, we're going to cover Genesis 37th chapter. And let's begin with the first verse, a little bit of the second verse. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. All right. This is actually more really getting into Joseph. All right. So just a family background. We'll go down here. We left off where Abraham's father Terah had died, and we questioned whether or not did he get the initial call that he didn't fulfill, and Abraham filled it, or did God specifically call Abraham? There's arguments to make both. So Abraham, of course, is disobedient, has Ishmael with his concubine or handmaiden Hagar under his wife's approval, but then the Lord says, no, you're going to have a son, Isaac. So, and through Isaac, your seed will be blessed. So, and after Isaac, he has twin sons, Esau and Jacob. Esau liked to hunt. Jacob was the mama's boy. Back to Abraham also, I don't know if you know, probably most Abraham also had 6 other sons after Sarah died, for whom come the Midianites and just other, but anyway, so back to Isaac and Jacob. Jacob was selected over Esau. Now Jacob, we all know through deceit, took Esau's birthright, but in the end, it seemed like that was the Lord's plan. So I don't know how that would have worked out. If the Lord had chosen him, somehow he would have got the blessing anyway, but instead Jacob did his way, and as a result he had to flee. So Jacob had 12 sons and 1 daughter. Right? There was Leah, the woman he didn't love, Rachel, her sister, who he did love, and each of them had 2 concubines. Handmaidens. That's basically what they were to Jacob. Bilhah and Zilpah. All right, Zilpah had 2 sons. Bilhah had 2 sons. Rachel had 2. Leah had 6, and a daughter, Dinah, which we'll talk about her during this lesson too. So, from these 12 sons come the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, today we're going to focus on, in the main story, the rest of this chapter is his oldest by Rachel. There's 2 of them, Joseph and Benjamin. And this is Joseph's story. So this is the time Joseph is about 17 years old, so not quite an adult yet, and in a time when people were still living longer than they were now, but the lifespans are starting to get to a normal level. They're still living past 100 years. All right. The end of verse 2 and through verse 4. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the son of Bilhah and the sons of Zillah, so that's the Jacob's wife's handmaids. His father's wives, but they're classified as Jacob's wives, so 4 wives Jacob had. And he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he had made a richly ornamented robe for him. It's the coat of many colors. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. So we see the background here. Joseph is the good boy. His father shows favoritism, says child of his old age, but also through Rachel, who is, is really the only wife he really loved. And you can imagine the other brothers, there was resentment for that. Now we also have Benjamin, but he's just a little boy at this time here, and he's also through Rachel, and we'll see later that Benjamin kind of takes Joseph's place. But where does a seed of favoritism and hatred come from? Let's just look back at the family. All right, Abraham sent Ishmael away, chose Isaac. Isaac loved Esau more, and his mother Rebekah loved Jacob more. I look to a passage I wrote down here in Genesis 25:28. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So, they both probably loved each other child too, but they loved it first. So Jacob grows up in a house of favoritism, and as he saw his dad favored Esau, he saw his mother favored him. And what does he do? He does the same thing. Rachel is his beloved wife, who's now died, who just recently died, giving birth to Benjamin. So Joseph is, the object of his affection. And the other 10 brothers, I'm sure, his 10 older brothers knew it, and they despised him. Okay, adding fuel to the fire is what happens next. Joseph has dreams. Dreams that will take many years to unfold, but dreams that will get Joseph through difficult times. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. So the hate starting to build up. Not only the father's favoritism, coat of many colors, now these dreams. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." So you can see, imagine what they were thinking then. If he wasn't, respected in their eyes, this was not going to help them very much. His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Verse 9, then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." All right. Like I said, Joseph is virtually character flawless. You got to remember, he's 17 years old here. If you have a bunch of brothers that don't like you, you don't want to add fuel to the fire. And this is maybe in his youth, and not really thinking. Telling them this is not really the best thing. And he even says here in verse 10, when he told his father as well as his brother, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" So even Jacob, who loved Joseph, said, "Joseph, you got to take it down a notch. Your head's getting a little big." But it also says, his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So he thought, even though maybe Joseph should have kept this to himself, as apparently this dream means something, and Joseph is going somewhere. So life is good for Joseph, as far as he knows. He's loved by his father, probably compared to the average person, has more material things in it, property and or sheep and livestock and probably a little bit of money. That code is saying he's going to be the heir to Jacob, so he's going to be the head of the tribe. And then we all come to this fateful trip. Been watching a little bit on YouTube, the Gilligan's Island. That's the key they say on there of the fateful trip. Joseph takes a fateful trip to go see his brothers. All right, verses 12 through 17. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he's putting Joseph in charge of this. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "They have moved from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" All right, the question arises, who is this guy? Who said this? One of the movies I saw about Joseph implies almost like it's an angel, because Joseph can't find him, and the guy tells him, and he goes back to thank him, and he's gone. Whether or not is that a case, because had he not told him where his brothers were, none of these events would have occurred. All right, I mentioned earlier, this is about to begin what is the worst day of Joseph's life, and little does he know he's going to get his brothers. Imagine, just picture the 10 brothers. Some of them are now even married and have children, and yet their teenage brothers put in charge of them. And so the hate is building up. You've got the bad report he gave about them. You've got the coat of many colors that his father gave to him, and the dreams that he told them. So Joseph approaches his brothers, and here we see the plot to take him down. Verse 18. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. And here, listen to the word, here comes that dreamer. So they were, referencing the dream. Come now, let's kill him. Throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. There, we'll see what comes of his dream. The oldest Reuben here in verse 21. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. So Reuben, the firstborn, shows sign of some compassion at least, but it's 9 against 1. So Reuben, he can't overpower all his brothers. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the desert, and don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So Reuben's plan was to have him put in there so it could stall and he could take him to his father. So Reuben did have at least the right attitude in this situation. And so Joseph came to his brothers. They stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe he was wearing. So that robe that they hated and they despised, tore it off of him. And they took him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty. There was no water in it. Imagine just to take up this. Even though he knew they didn't like him, just a betrayal Joseph felt, his brothers all ganging up against him, beating him up, throwing down in the cistern. And maybe he's pondering his face, are they going to kill me? Or are they just going to pull me out later on and say, that'll teach you a lesson? But of course, because he had to know the way his father favored him. If he knew what his brothers had done this to him, what would his father do to him? So he's got to be thinking, I'm never going to see my father again. Now, I did want to make the comment, Reuben, and we'll also see later that even Judah speaks up and somewhat of against this, because apparently there were some more rebellious than others. Once again, I saw a movie one time, and it implies Simeon and Levi were the worst, the second and third born. And one of the reasons it does, maybe because they were the ones who led the rebellion that we'll talk about later. But and he kept Levi. It was the only one he kept when he sends his brothers back. We don't know who. There was probably leaders in this, some who hated him more than others, but it seemed like the consensus was, at least, we're going to get rid of Joseph one way or the other, but they hadn't fully decided. And some of them really wanted to kill him. He discussed to got their heads together, cooler heads prevailed, and also the Lord had a plan for Joseph, so we knew they could not kill him when God had great, destiny for him to fulfill. So let's go down to the alternative plot in Genesis 37, 25 to 28. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. So in a sense, they're distant cousins to Joseph and his brothers. Judah, now this is the second one who's kind of come to the stance. Reuben actually wanted to rescue him, where Judah said to his brothers, and we'll see later, Judah becomes almost the leader of the brothers spiritually. What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover his blood? Come, let's seal him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. And his brothers agreed. So as bad as they were, they couldn't come to the fact of killing him. And so when the verse 28, so when the Midianites merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. So they would sold their own flesh and blood brother for a few pieces of silver. And this is kind of like, a future reference also of Judas betraying the Lord for 30 pieces of silver. So that's it. Judah suggests selling him to the Ishmaelites or Midianites. Their terms are used interchangeably, all descendants of Abraham, so they were relatives of Joseph distantly. And thus they would not have his blood on their hands as killing him. And so remember, these are, this is a little bit 1800 BC. You don't have no DNA, no Amber reports, no police, no detectives that could say, this looks fishy here, this trail here, this is a rough world. You stayed in your camp where you had security and stuff, and you go out into the wilderness, and anything goes, and somebody kills and captures, carries you off, you're never heard of again. So it was a lot easier to pull this off back then, was the point. So that's what they're thinking. They're saying, we've got rid of Joseph. We don't have to worry about our father pouring his love over him. We didn't kill him, and he sold off, and he's gone, and we're never going to hear from him again. What took care of that problem? Hot-headed in the moment. They attacked him, hot-headed in the moment. Even they're doing this without thinking about long-term consequences. So there they go. All right, finally we wrap up the chapter, verses 29 to 36. And we see the role of Reuben, the firstborn. So Reuben had left apparently. So we've got, so there's 11 brothers. We've got Joseph in the pit, the 9 other brothers, and then here comes oldest brother Reuben. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" I always wondered, did Reuben think they killed him, or did they tell him? It doesn't really say specifically. So did Reuben, like Jacob, think he was dead? Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. Once again, in 1800 BC, goat's blood, human blood, there's really no way to tell the difference. You can put under a microscope and see, what was what.
You don't have Abby shoe toe.
What's that?
You don't have Abby from NCIS.
Oh, gotcha. Right. That was a long way off. They took the ornamental robe back to their father and said, "Can you imagine doing this? We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. Did I read on further than I wanted to? No, we're still going here. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "in mourning will I go down to the grave to my son." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. So let's just look, at several things here as we wrap this up. First of all, again, Reuben, who seemed sincerely wanted to release Joseph. Was he trying to make up for sins of his own? And we'll get into what Reuben had done with one of his father's wives, caused him to lose his place as firstborn. Explain the horror Jacob must have felt. Just imagine someone, tragically losing a child, and what's that like? None of us here, thankfully, have faced that, but I've been in an environment where it's occurred, and just the gloom. And as their brothers are watching, not only the horror of their father, whose world is over right now, and knowing he's not dead, and they're the ones who's going to cause the father. He makes a statement again. Let's read this. "No," he said, "he wouldn't be comforted. In mourning, I will go down to the grave to my son." So his father wept for him. So his father said, "All the days for the rest of my life, no matter how long I live, I'm going to mourn." And so, but yet they still went forward with it. And they said, now there's no turning back. So at the end of the chapter, we're told Joseph is sold to Potiphar. So whoever these tradesmen were, they took him, and Potiphar in Egypt. See, the Lord's going already ahead of him, making a plan. Takes Joseph in. His brothers begin to move on with their life. Every one of them, I'm sure, consumed with guilt. So, although Joseph is about to spend, let's see, I think it's total of 13 years before he's promoted to Pharaoh. So for the next 13 years, Joseph is a slave, and some of that is in prison. And it's going to be 20 years until his brothers appear to him. So for the next 20 years, Joseph is going to have some bad days, but I can tell you this, I bet his brothers, it was worse. They were probably consumed by guilt. I don't keep bringing up this movie. It was a great movie, Joseph, on TNT about 25 years ago. It won the Emmy for best television movie that year. And one of the scenes, Judah's there, and someone casually makes a comment, not even really related to his brother, and he snaps, "You talk as though it was my fault." So it was probably like that. Just guilt was all over them, and they watched their father sitting there mourning, miserable day after day, knowing they caused this. I'm sure they said to themselves, even though we didn't like him, was that really worth it? But the Lord had a plan in it. So the overall theme of this was, Joseph had to go through horrible adversity, but as usual, when the Lord does that, it usually has a great plan for it. He knew he saw Joseph, he's forming character, and we're also going to see he's also going to use us to help reform his brothers as well, and then prepare them, which will eventually be going to Egypt to become a nation, which will become the nation of which he brings Jesus through. All right, we'll wrap up that first chapter this week. Next week, we're going to go talk a little bit about Judah and his incident, chapter 38 and maybe 39. What I'm going to do this over the next couple of months. So occasionally we'll have 2 chapters a lesson, and then sometimes we'll have 1. Any comments or questions about Joseph, his brothers? Lord, we come to you in prayer. Thank you for your time together. We ask that you bless every one of us. Bless the sermon this morning. Help us learn lessons from Joseph and how through adversity you bring your will and your plan and your purpose. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.